Good evening, everyone. Welcome back to the Astro Imaging channel. We've got another great show tonight. One of our favorite and most popular guests is back. Adam Block is here tonight, and he's going to teach us about comet processing. So those of you that frequent Adam's website will have heard of his Comet Academy, which is hands down the best and the most comprehensive comet-related instructional material that I've certainly seen. So if you want to learn how to process comets, you have definitely come to the right place tonight. But before we get to Adam's presentation, I do have just a couple of programming notes that I wanted to touch on. And let me share my screen here with the calendar. Bring that up. So unless you've been living under a rock for a while, the eclipse is next week. So we've got no show next week because we'll all be out various places chasing the eclipse around, trying to get some good photographs. So no show next week. Then the week after, we've got Claire Bradshaw, who's going to join us from the UK to talk to us about how she creates her astrophotography images. Then the following week, there's again no show because it's NEAF and NEAC that weekend. So we'll be off for that weekend. Then we'll be back on April 28th with Kai Jung. And I'm sure most of you remember his earlier part 1 presentation on the Sea Star. So he'll be back to finish that up. And then we've got Andrea Gironis to talk about solar imaging. And then we're going to do an episode with some of us here from the TAIC crew, processing the eclipse data that we all hope to get. And then we'll have another episode with some shorts. And you may have noticed that the workshop that was originally scheduled for tonight, we postponed that. We got a few responses, but not what we were hoping to get in terms of the number of submissions. And we had Adam, who was interested in, eager to do his Comet presentation, and that made a lot of sense to put on tonight because the Comet, at least the one that he's just been working on, is sort of running out at this point. So we wanted to jump on that while we had the chance. So hopefully we'll be able to get some more submissions and bring that workshop back around down the road. So with that, let me stop sharing the calendar here. So Adam, we're ready for your presentation here. Are you ready to take over?
Yeah, I think so. I think
all right.
This sounds good. So let me go ahead and begin sharing the screen, and then I'll start. So share entire screen, share. There we go. I still need to ask, can everyone see the screen?
Yes.
Good. You're presenting to everyone. Click here to return to the video call. Okay. Okay. Well, first of all, I just need to say right off the top that I'm always very excited to come on the Astro Imaging channel and talk about what I think are, some of the coolest things. And this subject in particular has been something I've been working on for the past few years. It's actually been something of a revolution in my mind in terms of processing this particular subject matter, which are comets. So comets are special kind of creatures in the sky in the sense that they are the high-speed photography subjects of astrophotography. And with that comes some really big challenges. There's a certain degree of complexity in trying to put together these images, and I'll be addressing some of that complexity tonight. In fact, it also informs the way in which I'm going to do this. The content that I'm about to present does, as mentioned, come from my recent course that I've put together. But I won't be able to, step by step, not in this shorter presentation, go through how to process any particular comet in any particular situation. That's the problem. there are just so many different situations. You can be doing an image like what is shown on the screen on the left, which is kind of the Earth sky view, and then you can do telescopic versions. And it all depends on the equipment, on the comet, on the environment, on everything. So I'm going to be diving into some of that, but talking more in the terms of some of the generalities of what you have to do. I will make one stop here to my website, where I would like to just point out, I hope that doesn't go into infinity, that sure enough, I do have Comet Academy here. And what I want to point out is not just that I show how to process the comets, but it's also a place to find very useful information about preparing to take pictures of comets, because the processing of a comet is so closely tied to that acquisition activity that you have to do. It's to the preparation of getting everything set. Your time may be limited and other constraints may make it difficult to get those images. So I just want to say that that is part of the course as well. It's in addition to the very technical side of the step-by-steps that are necessary. And because there are so many different variations, there are guides for each one of these variations that, again, go step by step with all the parameters and what you need to do to put these kinds of images together, whether it's through a telescope or just a camera on a tripod, as it so happens. So now I will go back to my presentation. That was here. And where I'd like to begin is in discussing literally what some of the considerations are when you think about taking a picture of a comet. Contrasting that with what are the considerations when you're going to take a picture of, say, a galaxy or a nebula. I mean, what do you really think about? You think about where it is in the sky, the coordinates. You would think about, is it above your horizon? Because even if you know where it is, it needs to be above the ground to take a picture of it. You might care about the moon phase, and maybe there are a few other things that you would worry about, but I think that pretty much covers it. I'm disregarding the environmental conditions, whether it's clear or cloudy, seeing, all of that applies anyway. But more specifically, I mean, what do you need to be concerned about? When it comes to comets, the concerns, it's a much longer list, actually. And that's what makes this such an interesting challenge. And so, Eric, are you still there?
Yes, I'm your designated patsy. So
yeah,
go for
it. Foil.
No, foil. Okay, foil.
There you go.
Go ahead, ask the question.
So the question is, let's make a list. I mean, I know the list, and so it's pre-canned. But, so people out there in the audience can, at the same time kind of think in their mind, what do you need to worry about? So list, a few things that are different than just coordinates and above the horizon. What else do you think you need to worry about?
I can probably tell you what I do. So if there's a comet around,
yeah,
the first thing I do is I go in the stellarium and I download the coordinates, I think from JPL. And I take a look at where it is.
Okay.
And of course, what time of the month it is, where the moon is.
Yeah.
Can I photograph it?
Yeah.
I say, well, maybe I can. So I try to figure out where it's going to be at the beginning of the session and where it's going to be at the end of the session.
Okay.
So I can set up my field of view so it's going.
Okay. So hold on. We're going to call that motion in field of view. Good. Go ahead. What's the next thing?
So motion in field of view, and then I just put in the coordinates, capture some data. The other thing I'll do is I'll make sure I'll get the coordinates of my field of view, and I'll go back later and get an RGB image so I can put it all together.
All right.
All right. My list is short. That's all I can think of.
All right. Well, then let me show you my list, and you'll get an idea of where I'm coming from, because again, it's so closely tied to that planning and optimizing the time that you need to spend out there to capture the image of the comet, but also how it is connected to perhaps the processing. And this is, I thank you very much, Eric. This has given maybe a couple of moments for people in the audience to think about it as well. Maybe they're typing it in feverishly on the chat sessions. So here's what I come up. This is actually where Pons-Brooks, 12P Pons-Brooks is right now at this very moment in the sky. This is literally Software Bisque's The Sky star chart, planetarium shot here. And it's not very far above the horizon. So if it's currently raining outside, but if it were clear, I would have a very limited amount of time to take pictures of the comet before it set. And so there's some pre-planning I'd like to worry about. The motion of the comet in particular, this motion, you mentioned the field of view, which is actually next on the list, but this motion is what exposure time can I expose the comet before it moves too much in the field? That is, moves across too many pixels before it is smearing in my picture. That, of course, depends on the plate scale, depends on the focal length that you are imaging the comet, so you'll need to know your focal length. We'll look at the plate scale here in just a moment, but knowing what the exposure time, the best exposure time is an important consideration. Motion of the field, as you mentioned, that's also important, depending upon how fast the comet is moving and whether it's going to move significantly through your field of view. Again, that might depend on the focal length and the field of view ultimately, but bulk motion of the comet, even when you have optimized the exposure time, is important. The tail is an important consideration because depending upon where you put the comet in the field of view is going to determine, the best kind of framing of the comet. And although you might be able to determine that in the field, because the time is limited, it would be even better if you knew in advance. Sometimes the tail and some attributes of the comet are so faint, you may not see them even in the short exposures, and it's only through stacking that you do see them, and then it's too late to make an adjustment at that point. So knowing in advance some information about the direction and length of the tail could be very valuable. There's a distinction between whether you're going to be tracking on the stars or tracking on the comet, and that is very strongly tied with the means or the method by which you're going to process the information. So making that choice is an important one, and there's reasons why you would choose one over the other. There are changes in the comet itself, right? So some comets, because they're either too far away or they're not active, really not close enough to the sun, you basically get a nice streaming ion tail. Maybe there's a little hint of dust and a halo, but ultimately over the course of an hour or so, it's just not changing. So you can take relatively long exposures, given you've optimized everything else, and there wouldn't be a downside to that. But some comets, closer, maybe more active, whatever it is, there's detail you might want to capture and not average that out by taking too many exposures and stacking them. So that consideration of what the comet is doing might be important. There is, of course, the window of time, as I described, and it could be a window that's determined just by the fact of how high above the horizon it is. That is a feature of comets, right? They tend to be brighter when they're nearer to the sun, more active when they're nearer to the sun, which means they're also being nearer to the sun. You need the horizon to block the light of the sun. That means they're going to be closer to the horizon. Limited window of time to do everything. There are considerations depending upon how you want to capture the comet. You may not have a choice given your equipment, but you can do mono with RGB or one-shot color camera. One-shot color camera acquisition is actually easier to do, but the surprising thing is it is not easier to process. There are some constraints. If you want to get the very best possible results with one-shot color camera data, there are some constraints that make the complexity more difficult than you might otherwise assume. And these are the kinds of bits of information I'd like to show because I don't think it's commonly known, especially in this particular area. And then narrowband doesn't help you with comets. Narrowband is something that people do in the city because they want the darker sky to be able to see the nebula that are in emission and so on. But comets already being in the twilight sky, often they just really aren't very bright in narrowband type emissions. So it just doesn't help you. And that's just another consideration, which makes them, again, that much more of a challenge. So here, let me just demonstrate comet motion, and this would be an excellent example. By the way, I don't know how well this will come across in the Zoom, or at least in the YouTube stream, but here's a motion of the comet going through the field, over the course of an hour or so. This is ZTF from February of 2023, and it illustrates that these are some of the concerns that I just mentioned, where the comet for any particular frame, if I were to expose any longer, would smear. So you want to optimize that exposure time. then you can see the length of the tail, even in a subframe, it's easy to tell it goes all the way across the field. So it would make sense for me not to put the comet in the middle of the field, but towards the left side, right, to get as much of the ion tail as I can. But I can't go too far to the left, because then we have a little bit of the, what is the dust tail, but it's the quote unquote anti-tail showing up to the left of the halo, to the left of the nucleus. So again, we want some kind of optimization to find out exactly where in the field of view we need to put the comet. And although we won't know ultimately everything, we can at least know some parts of this information. We can make a pretty good guess as to how we want to frame things, even without looking at someone else's picture. And so, oh, and the last thing here, I say detail versus average. This would be a good example of, I would say, you know, it doesn't matter if you do it across an hour or hours, because, you know, yes, the ion tail here is changing a little bit, but it's not in ways that are very exciting. So for me, what would be best is take all these images, stack them all together, and then you'll get a nice ion tail stream. It'll look smoother. It won't look very detailed, but then you'll get the wonderful, you know, halo head of the comet, and then get the anti-tail as well. So in terms of the comet tails, you know, there's one thing, of course, we know about comets is that they are entirely subject to the solar wind. And so the ion tail in particular always points away from the sun. You can use then your planetarium program to see in advance, you know, in terms of framing your field, how the, or what way the tail is going to point. It won't tell you how long the tail is, but it'll at least tell you the direction it's going to be. And that might tell you where in the frame you can know in advance where to put the comet. So you zoom out enough in a planetarium program like this is the sky, where you can see the sun. And then here, of course, I can see my little field of view that I can arrange on my star chart. And then I can see where the sun is. So I know that the tail is going this way in my field of view. And that already gives me some information in advance, so that when I go to the field and maybe I can't tell what things are looking like, but I already have a sense, oh, it must be this way, and that agrees with what I'm seeing on the screen, and I become much more confident about making sure I'm getting the very best image I can. If the comet happens to be very far from the sun at the time, then this trick I'm mentioning would be hard, because you can't see on your screen both the sun and the comet. The comet might be in the nighttime sky, right? So then instead of using the sun, you use the anti-solar point, or the Earth shadow, which is often again shown on many planetarium programs. So the anti-solar point is the direction the tail, the ion tail, will point to. Now the dust tail, of course, follows, you know, an orbital trajectory and not necessarily fully dominated by the solar wind, but they are closely related. I mean, it's not like they're going to be completely opposite of one another. So figuring out the direction of the ion tail is very useful information. Now, the other item on the list in terms of motion that I mentioned was trying to figure out a good exposure time. And so we have to do just a tiny bit of math to figure that out. We need to know our plate scale for the optics that we're currently using. And this applies to whether you have your camera on your tripod to, you know, using a mount with a telescope and the whole thing. Especially when you're tracking on the stars. We have the ability to know in advance, of course, our plate scale. You just take a special number here, 206,265, divided by the focal length of your optics in millimeters, and you're going to get arc seconds per millimeter, which is not very useful, because what you really want is arc seconds per pixel. So you multiply that answer that you see right there by the size of your pixels in millimeters, and then you'll have arc seconds per millimeter. You'll get the answer. So for the Takahashi 180 telescope that I occasionally get to use on top of Mount Lemmon, and I have used it to take some pictures of Pons-Brooks, it has a plate scale with the current sensor that I'm using of 1.5 arc seconds per pixel. So I just know that. And now I can look up some information. I can use my planetarium program, in this case, the Sky software biscuit tells me the answer. You can go to JPL Horizons. That's another great way to get this answer. And there's some other resources as well. The Minor Planet Center is another one, where it will tell you at any given time, of course, the orbits are well determined, right? At any given time, what the rate of motion is in RA and DEC. So you can see I've circled here that the RA rate, the bigger number, is approximately 0.05 arc seconds per second. That's how much the comet is moving. So the question becomes, well, then how many seconds do I have before it moves a pixel? That would be a nice thing to know. So I can get out my calculator, which I have handy here, and I would just take, 1.5, and I would divide it by 0.05, and I get 30. So 30 seconds, you won't be surprised, right? 30-second exposures at the plate scale that my system is at is what I would want to use, potentially. Although I would say that this is a little bit too conservative, because that's 1 pixel. But what is my my actual useful sampling? If I am undersampled, even being nearly undersampled, I mean, my stars are still 2 or 3 pixels in size, right? And then if you have a longer focal length, they'll be even larger, meaning that what you can actually resolve with your telescope is larger than this number, because that's just 1 pixel. So you really need to perhaps multiply it by 2 or 3 to get a more practical number. So when I was taking pictures with the Takahashi, I was actually using 60-second exposures, and you could not tell any smearing of the nucleus or anything like that. It was basically within the blur of what the atmosphere was providing me anyway. Some comets are moving very slowly, so you don't have to worry about this at all. But especially when they're nearing the sun, when the motions are the Earth and their motion, together equal larger rates, then you need to worry about what the optimal exposure time is. So let me show you a movie of what it looks like to start working with some of this data. And I need to describe, because I'm going to use these words over and over, that there are 2 particular, let's call them creatures, there are 2 particular elements of processing comet data. You're going to be working towards and eventually creating a picture that has just the comet, that's a comet-only image, or a starless comet image, whatever you want to call it. That's one thing that you need to create. And then there's another element that you need to create, which is a field of view that has the background, which basically, when I say background, I mean it has the stars and anything else in the field that's of interest that isn't the comet. There is a slightly small distinction between the background and the stars themselves, because we can extract stars using software today. It becomes yet another kind of sub-element of the background, and I will be talking about these things in the way in which we approach processing them in just a moment, kind of showing the flow of that. But here's an example of data that has the stars removed, and I was tracking on the comet. Let me show you. So this is not tracking on stars, right? This is actually tracking on the comet. If you have a mount that can do this, this offers another level of flexibility in being able to acquire the data. Sometimes it is better to track on the comet to create these images. And there is an innovative way of taking advantage of this because of a revolution that basically happened a couple of years ago with what Russ Krohmann basically did. I mean, there was StarNet, but I'm going to say Russ Krohmann really came to the forefront. And I was part of this because the moment that Russ released Star Exterminator, the very moment I recognized how amazing it would be to apply towards comet processing. So the first thing I asked Russ to do, I said, Russ, please, can you make Star Exterminator a batch process? He said, why? And I said, because it would be so great to remove all the stars of images to be able to create these comet-only images. It is much more, it does a better job generally than if you are limited to rejecting stars in the kind of the traditional way, especially if you don't have very many frames. Rejection of stars and everything in the traditional way of doing comet images is dependent on the number of frames and their quality and all of this kind of stuff. Whereas independently removing stars using Star Exterminator doesn't have that kind of constraint. So that was revolutionary. And then there's an additional bit, which is that star removal often means removing the nucleus of the comet, because the comet has a star-like nucleus, right? And other elements right there in the head of the comet can be extracted in the process of doing this star removal. But we don't want that. So the next thing I went to Russ and I said, Russ, can we please, as part of the batch processing, you know, it was available always to, Star Exterminator always honored masks on a single image, but not in batch processing. So I said, Russ, can we do this for the batch process? And it said, yes, of course. And so now what we have the ability to do is protect the nucleus and extract the stars. And that's what I'm showing here. So areas that are not, that don't have the extraction, where I'm protecting the head of the comet, will show stars, lots of stars going through. This will still have to take advantage of the traditional rejection to do its job. But if you're conservative about that masking, you'll find it works out very well. Even in this example, this is Comet Lemmon, it worked out perfectly. All of these stars kind of rejected near the head, and all the other stars were removed basically by the Star Exterminator process, and everything was great. Okay, so this is talking again about how to make these comet-only images. Let me show you one more. Here we have an example of data where I took the data, star tracking, that is sidereal motion, normal pictures, telescope is compensating for the Earth's rotation. And now I've aligned the image, all of the images, starless images on the comet itself. So we have a perfectly aligned comet, and then we see the motion of the background, which again, in this case, includes, there are no stars here, right? So, well, except for right around the nucleus where it was protected. But we have the galaxies. We have two galaxies in this frame, one going right into the halo of the comet, and the other is the one of interest, right? So the problem with this is, and this is an issue that I come across with content creators now, and even some of the experts on forums, is that there is this forgotten background. When people often talk about making processing comet images, the way in which it is typically done is you'll create a comet-only image like this, and you'll notice that we have blurred things like galaxies and maybe some excess halos of some of the bright stars. That's what these are. The halos don't get entirely removed. And so what you need to do is clean this, and you can just go into the clone stamp tool and make these go away, and then you'll get a nice clean comet-only image, right? And then what people will often do is you create the normal image that you stack together. These are aligned on the stars, and then you're going to get the blurred comet. Well, we don't want anything to do with this blurred comet. This is just a mess, and it's really hard to clean in any very nice way. It's really hard to do that. So what people do is they extract the stars, and then they say, okay, I've got my stars, I've got my comet only, and I'm just going to put the two together and be done. But I say that's incomplete. That is not the general solution here, because in neither of these images do you get the galaxy, right? Because when you extract the stars, you miss the galaxy. It won't be extracted. And over here, the galaxy is blurred. You still don't get it. And I'm not going to sit there and copy and paste galaxies. That's not the way to do this. I think that the best and general way to do this is you subtract the comet from the star frames, from the individual frames where you have the star and the you have the stars and the comet. And if you blink those frames, you would see the comet moving, right? So you would subtract the comet from each of those individual frames, and then you stack those. That will give you the stars in the background, and then you get to blend that with the comet-only image, and now you have the complete solution. Now, sure enough, if you don't have a galaxy in your frame, or you don't have a nebula in the background, you can take the shortcut as I just described. You can extract the stars. You just say, the heck with all that comet subtraction. You don't need to do it. You can just put the stars in here and be done. Sure, it's a shortcut, but that's not the general solution. General solution is to subtract the comet, which is something that you can do with PixInsight. There is, as part of comet alignment, it has the ability to subtract your comet master, comet-only masters, from these star-aligned images, the subs. And I'll point that out here in a moment. Oh, this is what one of a subtracted frame looks like. So you can see there's a little bit of a glow here. It's not perfect. Nothing in Comet processing is perfect. It is all very, very difficult to do very, very cleanly. So there will still always be cleanup, but what we're trying to do is really minimize the cleanup, minimize the amount of touch-up that we need to do at any particular step to give ourselves the best result. Now, this slide is kind of the complete slide, and I just want to dazzle you for a moment with the completeness of this. This is not what I actually put in Comet Academy. I decided after I made this slide that no one is going to really want to dive in and try to understand the overview. People really want to see the steps, right? That kind of linear step by step, what do you have to do? But I can't demonstrate all of that processing tonight. So what I'd like to do is actually use this, since I happen to have made it, as an overview, a bird's eye view of the considerations that you need to have when talking about, you know, producing these images with the Comet-only images, that Comet-only master, as well as what you might consider for the star fields and that background, what to do with those images. And as I've alluded to, there are these kind of two paths of processing. One path leads you to Comet-only images. If you're doing monochrome imaging, you're going to end up with 3 images. You have a master red Comet-only starless image in red, and 1 in green and 1 in blue. But if you're doing OSC, yeah, you just end up with 1, which is great. You get a single master. And when going in that direction, then that's one path. And then the other path is to create the star field, which is going to have a blurred comet, but it's basically normal processing, continuing to do the normal processing on the rest of that data. Let me show you then what will be a critical part before you go on those 2 paths, one path towards comet-only image and the other path towards this the star field image with the background, is you're going to need to pick a reference frame to align the images on. And this is going to be important for both the starless images as well as the star field images. And the way in which I show this in my course is to pick one reference frame. There is one reference frame that rules them all, right? So once you pick a reference frame, that's the one you're going to use for the rest of your processing. It's very useful to have just one, because then you don't have to think about anything else. But there are some consequences of doing that, and I'll show you what they are. So here's a picture of Comet Leonard moving against the background, stars and sky. In this case, there's a globular cluster, M3. And you can see the amount that it moves through time. Let me just point out a couple of things here. One is you'll see there is some variation in the quality of the data. Hopefully it comes across that some of the frames have some haze or clouds in them. Secondly, you'll notice the nucleus swings by some bright stars at times. There's a consequence of that as well, as you'll see in a moment. But what I generally do when I pick a reference frame is I'm picking a frame that's in the middle of the travel for whatever for the length of time that the exposures, the subframes have gone across. And now if it's very short, it doesn't really matter. But if you have a significant amount of time, as this demonstrates, picking a middle frame can be useful for a number of reasons, not only because of the edges of the frame where you have to shift things, but also dealing with an alignment that I'm going to be touching on in just a moment. So now let me go ahead and show the Comet alignment process, because I've talked about it, in PixInsight. It'll be the one PixInsight thing that I'm basically going to be showing tonight. PixInsight. And this is the Comet alignment tool or process. What you can see I have loaded here are frames, and you may not be able to see this, but they are all of the frames. These are the red, green, and blue frames. So there's this path where we're trying to create a comet-only image. So we need to align the frames on the comet, right? But given a particular reference frame. So one of these frames, of all of these, how many do I have? 39 frames. One of them is going to be a chosen reference. I usually pick the green image, and I usually pick it somewhere in the middle. You know, maybe I say green number 7 here. That becomes my reference frame. And I will say that this is my reference. I set it as my reference frame. that means that the 0, 0 in terms of relative motion is going to be that frame. And the way that you use this tool is you can click on one of these frames, and you're going to tell Comet Alignment, you're going to tell PixInsight, where the comet is. So this is a raw linear, well, it's not raw, it's a calibrated frame, right? This, just to be clear, this frame has been calibrated. And if this were OSC, it would also be debayered. And that's actually it. When I show you the flow chart in a moment, you can see there's one more distinction. But let me just show you the comet. So I'm just doing the STF here so I can see there's the comet. And you'll see that this, it's kind of hard to see. The quality of this data is not very good, but there is a star here next to the nucleus, right? That's already an issue, because when you try to click on the nucleus here, one of the operations that happens is that it tries to do a centroiding on the comet nucleus. But if the star is there, it's attracted, if you will, to the star. It's calculating, the center of quote unquote mass, or the center of amount of light. And that's going to be basically the star. So we can't, that'll mess things up. So what we can do is override the centroiding, because I can clearly see, you may not be able to see this on your screen, but I can see that the nucleus is there and not on the star. So I can do basically a control click with my mouse, and I can click anywhere I'd like, but I click on the nucleus, and that will be a correction that'll be important. That's the first frame of the set. When you use Comet Alignment, it loads the frames in chronological order. And that actually tells you how I acquired this data. I acquired this data by interleaving the exposures, red, green, blue, red, green, blue, red, green, blue. That is useful when doing monochrome imaging, because you have the opportunity to reject things better, because you put more time between each successive frame. It's nice with OSC that you can sit there and bang away, but if the comet is in the same spot every time, you actually need a little bit of time for the comet to move in order to take advantage of rejection abilities when stacking the data. So it's kind of nice that comes out naturally when interleaving exposures when doing mono imaging. But this does assume that you have enough time to get enough of these, right? So there's this play between having time to do RGB exposures compared to just sitting there and just taking full color images one after the other. When using Comet Alignment, then we have it all arranged chronologically, so you can click on that first frame, which we did, and we found the comet, or in this case, I made an adjustment. Then you can click on the last frame, and you can tell it where the comet is in that frame. Just need to give it a second to load. Here it is. It's not even the same color, by the way. This happens to be a different color, but this is where the comet was at this particular time, regardless of the color, right? This time the centroiding is just fine. And what the tool is going to do is it is now going to calculate the positions for the comet in between all of these other exposures. So if I now go to any other frame, it's going to show me potentially where the comet is, not because I clicked there, but because it's calculating a linear motion. See, it didn't get the star, right? It got where the nucleus of the comet is, not the star, because it's not actually looking at anything. It's just calculating based on the time, assuming the comet's moving linearly, where the comet is from one step to the next. So that's how Comet Alignment does its job. However, there's a little more complexity here. One bit of complexity is that there are some improvements to this calculation where instead of just doing linear motion, there is a checkbox here that's called Compute PSF Fits. Fits meaning fitting the motion of the comet. And what'll happen is when I actually tell it to do the alignment, right now you're seeing the linear computation. But when it actually goes in align, it tries to compute better centroiding at each position, even though I didn't click at each position. So it's not going to totally assume then linear motion. And when you use Compute PSF Fitting, if the comet motion is a little bit curved, then that will be taken into account. So it's better than just straight up linear computations. There's a big but, and this really is a big one. When there are stars that move near the nucleus, it messes it up every time. So you can't use this without at least correcting for that by clicking. You can't just use blindly compute PSF fitting. I know that Juan has recently, the developer has recently changed the size of the aperture to minimize the amount of that problem. But ultimately, you can't do this without paying attention, basically, babysitting it. If you do without it, which is the original way, and it will almost always work unless you find that you have some motion that needs to be more accurately computed, you can do without the compute PSF fitting. It will always use that linear computation. And you can always click on any frames in between to force the fit of linear fitting between any points that you have added. So if we literally clicked on every single frame and said where the comet is, it won't be doing any computing. It will only use where you have, of course, clicked, right? So the fact that we have this large separation of time here between all these frames is fine as long as the comet is moving linearly. And you can check, again, just by clicking on any other frame and just seeing, did it really, centroid right there on the nucleus of the comet? And it did. So the linear motion in this particular case is as precise as needs be. Okay, so that's how you use, now I'm not going to do the process here, this outputs comet aligned images, and that's what I just showed you in the movie, was basically the output of this kind of step. So let me now go back to my PowerPoint and go to the next frame. There we go. So now let me mention a few things about the workflow specifically, and then if there are any questions, I'll pause and address them and then kind of continue on, because it'll be a natural place here. When you work with the data, here's what it looks like in PixInsight anyway. You do the normal image calibration, and if you're using one-shot color camera data, of course, you have to debayer those images as well. And then you would align those images, like say star alignment. But you're also going to do the separate path of comet alignment, which is what I just showed. But the question is, are you going to align those images of the comet on this frame, which is what most people do, right? This frame is the stuff that comes out of star alignment. These are star aligned images. So they've already been manipulated, interpolated once. Or do you do the kind of clever thing and you align your images on the data that is outputted before it goes into star alignment? And if you can, that is usually going to give you the best result, right? Because now you're not aligning twice the comet. Instead, you only do one alignment of the comet. One of the things that I have found useful is that because the comet is moving, actually not dithering the data, if you have a telescope and it has automation and you dither, actually not dithering is kind of nice, because it maintains the ability you won't mess up the fact that you want this linear motion when you use comet alignment, and that can be very useful. So given the choice, a lot of people do this, but for optimal, for the very best results, you don't want to do the comet align, or do the interpolation aligning of the comet twice. Once you have aligned the frames, then you can do star exterminator. I referred to this earlier. Why? Why do I have to wait to do star exterminator after I've aligned the frames for the comet? And the reason is because you're going to potentially want to use a mask. The mask is going to protect the nucleus, and you can't do that until you have aligned the images on the comet to begin with. So star exterminator follows from, if you're going to use this masking technique, the batch mask, then you need to align the comet first, then remove the stars. And then there's all kinds of important considerations when it comes to local normalization that will improve your comet images. And I talk about that in the course. I'm not going to go into that technicality now, but there are some important considerations there. And then ultimately, you're going to stack this data, that should have no stars in it, should just have the comet, might have a little bit of activity around the nucleus that because you protected it, you stack it, and now you have a comet-only master. Now you have that thing that we need to blend with our star field image that we have yet to create, and I'll mention that in just a second. So let me just pause and ask, are there any questions out there so far?
Adam, there was one question about dithering, but you already answered that. Other than that, I don't see.
Yeah, so dithering in general is fine. And even if you had dithered data, the linear computation, once it does the alignment, should work. But I have had some problems with it. So the safe thing to do, if you know that you're going to be doing something like this, yeah, don't even bother to dither, because usually it's going to be the motion of the comet that matters, right? It's not falling on the same pixels. So that naturally is kind of a natural dither, if you will. And it can help you with making life easier for comet alignment.
That's the only question I see. Alex, you see anything?
Yeah. Hey, and he's answered that also, I believe. Yeah, the question was about Michelle asked, is in this example, is everything already registered, and are they registered to the stars? And I think you've discussed that.
Okay, right. But we have more to go. So we're only halfway there. Now we got to talk about the star field. So let me show you this. So when it comes to the star field, we're going through star alignment, because the output of star alignment are star registered images, right? We have a moving comet in those frames. If you blink those subframes, the comet's going to be moving, but the stars and galaxies and nebula, everything's aligned there. And basically, it's just normal processing at that point. You just process the image, you get your master, I'll call it a star field background, whatever you want to call it, image. I'm going to call it a star field image. It may still have background information, right? And so that's normally processed. But what I wanted to keep on this screen is I want to talk about one-shot color camera. I'll just make it 1 minute here, because one of the constraints for one-shot color camera processing is to do drizzling with the CFA drizzle. I'm not talking about upsampling the image. CFA drizzle will allow you to avoid certain kinds of artifacts and color distortions that you can get when you stack debayered images, basically. When you do drizzling, it keeps track of the reds and greens and blue pixels, so you completely avoid those artifacts. But drizzling, and here's the thing that I don't think is clear to many people, it's kind of a complex operation. Drizzling always refers to the non-registered and non-debayered data. This box right here is what drizzled data, when you integrate the data, you are integrating these files. You're not integrating these files. It has nothing to do with this, with the output of star alignment or image integration or even normalization. Yeah, not normalization either, in terms of a physical image. These images that are output have nothing to do with the drizzle integration. Drizzle integration refers to this, but what gets updated by going through this process, by going through star alignment, the drizzle data, that is the shifts of the stars and the shifts of the images are recorded. And then it needs to be updated again by image integration to update rejection and normalization answers per pixel. So this data gets updated, and then you get spit out new drizzle data, as well as a regular star field. The regular star field you don't use, or at least you don't normally use it, because you're interested in the drizzled star field. This is the actual result that you want. Yes, you get this as output, but that just comes as an extra thing. You actually drizzle using you're actually drizzling this data over here using this information to do the operation here, and that's how you get a drizzled star field. I don't think people appreciate that, but to appreciate that means you're going to appreciate why you can't do something with one-shot color camera data that you can with mono data. And I'll show you that. It's coming up in just a moment, actually right here. So now I'm going to talk about, you have these star fields, and you have the moving comet, and when you create those star field masters, you just have a blur of a comet, right? So what you really want to do is you want to subtract the comet from each frame before you stack them. And that's what we're looking at here. This is a blink of the comet subtracted frames. It's not perfect. It'll never be perfect. You can see still the nucleus of the comet here, but keep in mind that if you have a lot of frames, life gets easier because just the process of rejection is going to minimize even this. So there will be, in the integrated result here, the stacked result, there's going to be a little bit of a blob over here. But the rest of the comet, the tail, that whole tail that was stretching across that field of view might have been going across a nebula or a galaxy or whatever it is. And by subtracting the comet, you can get a better representation of the background. And so that's why comet subtraction is such a powerful thing. Let me see if I can go to the next slide. Yes. So in this slide, let's see, what did I do? Yes, we have, you remember here, we have our star-aligned frames, and we need to subtract from every one of them the comet. And that means we're taking our comet-only masters, which we created, and we're going to subtract that same image from each of these frames, but the comet is moving, right? So comet alignment is going to shift this image so that it aligns with each of these frames and then subtracts the comet from it. Now, the subtraction, again, isn't going to be perfect because this comet master is an average of all of your frames. It's not the same as every individual subframe, but it's a very good representation. It's a very good approximation of what every subframe image of the comet is like. So that's what we're doing here is we're going into comet alignment a second time, loading those frames again, and subtracting the comet from the star aligned data. So this is what we get output. We get output another set of data. This data is very similar to this, but it just has the comet subtracted. So now we're not even using this. We're using this information here as far as the comet subtracted. This is what we're going to integrate. This is what we're going to stack to make, to be our star fields. So look at what we have here. We have now 3 star fields. We have a regular star field, non-drizzled. If you're using OSC, we end up with an OSC star field with a blurred comet. And then we end up with a star field down here that doesn't have a blurred comet, doesn't have a comet at all. It hopefully just has the background. But it cannot be drizzled, not for OSC. You cannot do comet subtraction on with drizzling in place for one-shot color camera data. Ta-da! Can't be done. So that includes, it's literally not designed, and I think you can appreciate why. Remember, if you were to somehow do that trick, you would somehow be subtracting this comet-only master from the non-registered, non-debayered data, this box. Imagine what that is. That would be so hard. I don't even know how you would program that if it's possible. So comet subtraction with drizzled data is not a thing for OSC information. And that means that you need to manage, and I'm not going to go into the details here, but you need to manage utilizing all of this information that you have. Basically, I'll tell you part of the secret is you use the drizzled star field to get the color right. Then you use the regular star field for the parts of the drizzled star field that are not correct or unwanted. You can basically blend these two images together to make the very best results you can, right? Or you can use this version, this stacked data without the comet rather, to, I said that wrong. This is really the regular star field, the one without the comet, I should say. You can use the drizzled star field and manage these two images to put them together in such a way you get that perfect background that's properly color calibrated. And then you can blend that with your color master, and then you've done it. You've done the whole trick. But there's a little complication there, and I just wanted to say that was the comet complication. So I'm going to now show you comet alignment, and I'm going to explain another element of comet alignment that is not even explained in the documentation. But it's an important one to consider because, especially if you're doing it the way that I suggest, by using just a single reference frame. Now, maybe it was implied that everyone just understands it, but I'm not convinced that that's the case. When you have one of these comet-only masters, it is what in the tool is called a comet operand, because you're subtracting that from each of the star field frames, the individual subframes, right? Yeah. So now I'm going to go back to PixInsight here. And let me just close these. When you're using one-shot color camera data to do this, you're going to be subtracting from those star field images, right? But there's no distinction. There's just you just load all of your frames. There's no distinction between red and green and blue. But if you're doing monochrome imaging, of course, what you have, maybe I should show you. See at the bottom of this list here, these three, you may not see these files, I'm sorry, but these three files are my Comet only images. I just showed you a picture of one. I'll show you the green one again. So this is the Comet only image here. And what I do in Comet alignment is I only load the green data, right? So here, I think I can do that. If I just come here, if I'm in the correct, I'm not in the correct directory. See, there's always something that's going to mess me up. So I need to go to, those are the registered images, right? And then I would only go into, say, the green data here. I would load the green data. Okay. And it's this frame. Now, the way that it works is you have to take it off the disk. So I need to, now I go back to my Comet aligned directory, which is here. And then I go to starless here. And this is my master. So that's my operand. I'm loading the operand here in this field. So I'm telling it, this is the frame that I want you to subtract from each of these frames. And I save it to the correct place. As far as the alignment is concerned, it's the same thing you did before, where you're going to, potentially click on the first and last frames. The same problem with the, if there's any stars coming by, all of that stuff is all still the same. But then you can subtract them, and the output are these Comet subtracted images. Here's the complication. It's not a complication. It's just something you need to understand. Remember the reference frame. We have to pick a reference frame here. Well, if you recall, earlier I just said, well, green number 7 is my reference frame. So I would set it to be my reference like that. And then I would do my work. I would output my green Comet subtracted frames, and then I'm done. No problem. But here's the thing. If I now I'm ready to do my red data, right? I have to go back to my registered images. These are, see, I've got Comet subtracted, but these are the red images before Comet subtraction. I load them in. I'm going to change my operand here to be, now I have to go back to my Comet aligned. I hope you're following all this. I have to go get my operand image. This is my red Comet only image there. So I've loaded that as my operand. This image will be subtracted from each of these. But remember, it needs to shift this image to align with each of these. What do I choose for my reference frame here? Remember, the green image is my reference. There is no red image that occurred at that green time. That's the key. The key is that I have to load the green frame to be my reference. So that frame, I would have to add one more file here. Come over here, I go to my registered images, I go to my green, I find green number 7. I load it in here. Now, I'm not going to actually subtract my red frame from this green image, but this green image, I make my reference, and then I remove it from consideration to be subtracted. So it just acts as a reference frame. Now, that's the part that, if you haven't thought about it deeply before, can be confusing. So let me just show you one more slide on this, which tries to indicate how this works. Remember, when we created these Comet-aligned images, those Comet masters, and this is applying to mono images, let me just be clear about that. If you have one-shot color camera, it doesn't matter. But for the mono images, that I have red and green here shown for red exposures and green exposures. So, and because I'm interleaving them, you can see here that I have a green exposure, then I took a red, and then maybe I took a blue, right? But I'm not showing blue. So green, red, green, red, green, red, one in between the other. So as time moves on, I am doing these different exposures. So time is just moving horizontally here. Now, the comet masters, those comet aligned images, the comet only images, the red comet only is aligned to the green, because remember, the green is the master. It's the green number 7. So these frames are all aligned to green number 7. They're all aligned to this time right here, 5:30, whatever that means. They're all aligned to 5:30. But if I take this red image, right, it's aligned to 5:30, and I try to subtract it from a red image taken at 5 o'clock, it doesn't work. I can't shift that because there was no red frame that actually happened at 5:30. That's why the green reference will allow me to make my shifts, to shift this red frame the proper amount so that it subtracts it properly in time. And that's basically the whole trick behind using comet alignment. And you have to load the one frame that you used, even though it's not the right color, the same color that you're subtracting, it becomes the reference that you use. I should also mention that down here at the bottom, you can see that there is another way to acquire the data where you could just do all of your reds and all your greens and all your blues. The logic I said still applies, and maybe it even makes it more obvious why it applies. I will tell you a trick though. If in time the interleaving is short enough, and you find you just don't get a perfect subtraction for whatever reason, let's say that, you know, I was purposely using my image here to be my reference, but let's say that this frame happened to have aligned better with one of these, you know, as far as shifting is concerned, make it a reference to make these shifts better, to make that subtraction better. You might look on a frame either side of what is your reference, one of those other frames, and maybe that'll give you a better alignment. Something to consider, but in general, I have found like 90% of the time that what I'm saying works. You just make sure to load that reference of the other color when you are in the other colors, and then everything will work out well. So I'm going to pause. Well, no, I won't. Here, I'll mention, this is the full consideration. I think I've already mentioned this, though. The full consideration is for OSC. It's crazy because you have these different outputs, and you need to keep track of all of them and then utilize them all in such a way that you're balancing the pros and the cons of each of them. The drizzled star field, for example, you can't subtract the comet from it. It's going to have the comet blurred image in there no matter what. There's just no way to do it. But you utilize that drizzled star field to get the color right. So OSC considerations are you're using multiple components to create the image, whereas with mono, you don't have that problem. Everything kind of comes together a bit more naturally. So that's why I say there's a complexity to doing OSC when it comes to the processing, not the acquisition. So it seems like the pain gets distributed, you know, there's some kind of conservation of pain when it comes to acquisition and processing. If you don't have it on one side, you've got it on the other for some reason. All right, now I'll pause. I have just one more subject that I'd like to cover, which is a little bit of information about the DSLR Earth-Sky consideration. This is a completely different approach to comet imagery, different than kind of the telescopic examples that I've been talking about. Are there any questions about anything that I've mentioned?
Couple of questions. Isaac said, won't tracking on the background but aligning on the moving comet create a walking noise? You know, I've seen things like that where you seem to have noise kind of going across the image.
Yeah, it will on the background, right? Not on the comet, on the background, because that's where that would be. The comet really is landing on different pixels when you align on the comet. It is self-dithering. But sure, on the background you can. Although what's interesting is it depends on how bad it's going to be. You may not have the number of images to do great dithering anyway. It really depends on the amount of time that you have and so on and so forth. The walking noise generally is not the bigger problem. There are bigger problems with gradients in the images and so on that are just larger than the walking noise in general, and that's usually a lesser consideration actually. So it is true, you can get walking noise, but it's usually not the bigger problem. Yeah.
Okay.
I'm not saying don't dither. You can dither. You can certainly dither. It's not like the end of the world, but you just need a monitor when you do comet alignment. If it's assuming linear motion, you want to check and make sure that it is calculating properly at each one.
And Michelle asks, you use the same frame for comet and star alignment?
Yes, that was the point. It's one reference to align all, and then you get to use the logic that I just explained. Yeah.
And have you ever considered this coming back the next day and taking an RGB image? And doesn't that get around a lot of the issues that you have with stars and comets and putting them together?
Well, you can always take a picture of the field. Yeah, I mean, that's true. You can take a picture of the field, though you may not be able to easily, again, if these things are low in the sky, that the ability and the time to be able to do it, it might be cloudy. You just may not have that other opportunity. I think it's better to consider getting all of the data in one session if it's possible. It also tends to produce a much more natural image, to be honest, because you are taking from the same data, right, to make the different components come together. But sure, I mean, you can take a picture of the same field once the comet is gone. Some comets, it takes a while. If you're doing a wide field image like Suchinshan, which is the other 62P, the other comet, it was in the field of view of the Takahashi for like a week. What are you going to do? Wait a week? You might not have another opportunity. So I do think that what I'm demonstrating is the more powerful way to consider it. Certainly, it is an option though if you have it to just wait for the comet to get out of there and then take the background. Sure.
Well, I have a 4-meter scope, so sometimes you don't. I mean, a day is plenty of time to wait for that comet.
Yeah, it depends on the focal length. But again, yeah. I'm talking. I'm not talking to you. I'm talking to lots of people.
No.
Different considerations. Yeah.
Okay. Dan has another question just popped up.
Yeah.
Isn't the subtraction operon image an integration of all the comet-aligned images?
Yes.
Therefore, subtraction won't have the same brightness as the individual subtracted subs. Is that a problem?
Yeah, I didn't mention something that was important because it's a technicality, but you'll notice in the comet alignment, let me go back, there is a checkbox here called linear fit. And linear fit is going to match, or try to anyway, the background and the signal brightness of that comet-only image so that it subtracts even better than it would otherwise do. The image that I showed you was actually not even linear fitted. And you'll find that the subtraction, if the conditions are not variable, if you don't have a lot of clouds and things, that subtraction is actually pretty surprisingly good. The variations that you get from frame to frame across short periods of time are really quite small. So even without the linear fitting, the subtraction can be very good. But I show in my course that you need to take into account that it might work better with or without. You'll find that when the comet is it takes up a large portion of the frame and it's very bright, that the linear fitting is usually more necessary. Whereas if you have a very faint comet, because it's really taking into account just the background, which has nothing to do with the comet, because the comet's just faint, then linear fitting tends not to work as well.
Those are our questions.
Okay, cool. Thank you. So I was going to talk just a little bit about the Earth-sky kind of considerations here, and I'm not going to go into detail. This gets even trickier, and there's really lots of complications because you're not getting the kind of consistent data set that you do like telescopically. You might have your camera on a tripod. Maybe you're tracking on the sky, maybe you're not. In this case, for this image, I was tracking using a star adventure. In fact, I should mention that if you haven't seen my YouTube, it's just a 6-minute video about my process of getting this particular picture. I would encourage you to check out my YouTube video on it. It'll give you some hints as to what I was doing. But I was using a star adventure to track, and that allowed me to take 20-second exposures. My exposures were not then limited by the motion of the comet at all, because I'm not really zoomed in much. My focal length is 85 millimeters. That's the lens I was using. But instead, it was really the brightness of the sky. The combination of the twilight just plus light pollution. I was imaging it. It's something between border 4 and 5 for this particular image. Means that the longest I could go is about 20 seconds. So that's what determines my exposure time. And what I wanted to mention are a couple of interesting features of PixInsight that can be helpful. One of them is that when you're taking a picture of a comet that's setting on the horizon, through the course of time, the horizon in your images is going to be rising up into the frame, right? If you're tracking anyway. It's also true if you later align your images on the stars, again, the horizon is going to be creeping up. So what happens is that stars are effectively going to be moving out of your frame, or you can think of it as the ground moving into the frame, however you want to think about it. And sometimes that messes up the alignment routine. If you want to use PixInsight to align your images, which is a perfectly valid thing to do, then what can often help is you can force PixInsight to only use a preview, to only use a fraction of the field. And that might be a better way, as much of the field as you can, but to exclude where the ground becomes an issue, because that way it doesn't look at those, sometimes those stars are in some frames and not in other frames or whatever it is. And that might cause some confusion for either some frames or lots of frames. So you can use previews as a way to force star alignment to only look at a sub-fraction of the frame. So I wanted to mention that. And I also wanted to mention, and this one was in particular very important for my ability to align images, especially with like these really wide field, like camera lens kind of wide field images, which is that the default settings in star alignment in PixInsight are a transformation option, whereas what you really want is the other one, which is this one, the thin plate splines method of registration model. It is the one that takes care of distortions across the field much better. Now, you might think this is a technicality, but it's not. I can show you. So let me go back to PixInsight here. Yeah. I teed up images here in Blink where I have a set of images where I'm looking at the first, let me show you the first image. This is let me zoom out, I guess, hold on. This is the first image I took near the beginning of the session. And then I had the last image where you can see the ground has come up into the frame, right? And these two images are actually aligned, kind of. So if I come up here kind of more towards the top of the frame and I blink the two frames, you can see that the stars look, they're reasonable if I flip between the two frames. Now, it so happens that in the beginning, my focus wasn't great. I learned that later. So later I figured out I was out of focus and then I got it in focus, which is good. But if I come down, I have to use the scroll bar here, to the bottom of the frame. So here's let's go, somewhere down here, I hope. Do you see how the stars are shifting a lot? So it's not just a translation. It's literally the frames are being warped. If I could, you won't be able to see this if I'm zoomed out. But if I'm zoomed out and you watch the stars here, it almost looks like there's a compression of the stars near the bottom. There's a distortion that the initial warping that was done to try to align these images was basically not correct because of the algorithm. And so the better, more comprehensive algorithm that generally can take care of this is the thin plate spline. So now let me show you the same data, exactly the same data, but using thin plates. And again, I'll come down at the top, they're aligned already, but I come down here to the bottom where we're looking again at these stars near the bottom. Now I might be in the ground. Yeah, see, I'm in the ground there. Hold on. Let me get above the ground. Okay, we have stars right here, the very bottom, and they're perfectly aligned. So that's another consideration. These are the tricks that you'll want to know. Sometimes people feel that, you know, the default setting are good enough, but no, there are no defaults. That is an illusion, a persistent one as it might be, but it really is an illusion, especially when it comes to processing images in any one of these softwares. And I also want to say that it also goes towards an idea that people often have with other programs, but even within a single program, just because you get an answer. I got an answer here the first time, but it's only when I zoomed in and I looked closely at the data that I knew that the answer was not correct or not optimal. I shouldn't say not correct. I should say not optimal, right? So just because you get an answer does not mean it's the best answer you can get. And if you go around thinking that defaults, you know, are going to somehow give you a reasonable result, you're going to be disappointed more often than not. So that's just a lesson that I've learned, and I think it's an important one. Let me show you the last bit that I think was critical to making that image as good as I think it, you know, came out to be.
Adam, before you move on, you brought up something that there's a question that popped up. How do you force star alignment to use a preview?
Okay, let me just show you star alignment, sorry. Star alignment by default does it. I didn't mention it because it actually does it. When you draw a preview, it does it. Let me get star alignment. You'll notice that under, don't know where it is. Where is it? Yeah, under star matching, the default, you'll find it's checked, restrict to previews. When there is a preview, it will use it. And by the way, that has bitten me a number of times because I leave some preview in an image that I might be using on the desktop. And then I try to align images and it's not aligning. I'm like, why is it not aligning? It's because I have some tiny little preview there because I was using it for, you know, background normalization or neutralization or whatever it was. And there are no stars in there and it couldn't align on that. But anyway, how you would do it here is you would make your reference frame an open image with a preview, but then you load as your target images the actual files on disk. And then it will force it to use the preview that's in your open image, and then you're aligning on the files that are on disk and everything can work. Does that make sense?
Yeah, so that means it's useful when you have a background rising up on a wide field image.
You can't, you know, I should say that I would only use this technique if it failed. I wouldn't use this proactive, you know, yeah, I wouldn't use this in advance. Of course, I would just try to align the images without this. But then if you have a problem, this might be something you can lean on as a potential solution, right?
Okay, thank you.
Adam, before we leave that portion, it aligns the stars on the preview with the stars in the target frame, but it also aligns all the other stars too.
Yes, of course. So if there are distortions that it's unable to see, if you will, outside of your box, it won't be accurate as it would be if you use the whole frame. But if you take it the other way, you know, if it doesn't see stars, then you have an additional kind of problem. So yeah.
You know, that button being checked by default seems like something they should change because I never heard that before.
Well, that's why I come on the show.
No. maybe you could suggest a one that have that.
Well, you know, it usually doesn't come into play because normally when you're aligning images, you're doing it from disk images, right? The only way this would bite you is if you're aligning images that are views, and then, you know, you would be aligning a view. Usually people would align a view with another view, and then you have views that you've aligned, right? You would be loading views in here. And then that's where it's bitten me in the past. It's very rare. In fact, I've never seen anyone do this, but I found it to be a nice trick that you make a view instead of making a file a reference. You can make a view a reference that has a preview, and then you utilize that feature to help you to align your images that are on disk. Yeah, so it's a one-off thing, but I'm just saying it's a possible tool. If you didn't know it exists. The fact that it's checked is probably fine, but it's nice to know of that behavior of previews. Okay.
Did you see that other question? You want to take that? No. From Gary Peters. Is Adam saying that your Bortle number is the less exposure times you should be shooting? The higher your Bortle number, the less exposure time you should be.
Yeah, well, I think because this literally, if you took a longer exposure, the sky is just so bright in the image that, I mean, it's not saturating maybe, but it's just so bright that the total amount of information you have between the sky and what's left of your dynamic range is very small. I mean, I was literally getting, I don't know how to say this, but it was like 30 to 40% of the image was just sky brightness when I was taking those images. It's almost like I was taking a flat field, right? So it depends on your, you know, your ISO and the lens that you're using. I mean, I was operating the 85 millimeter at 1.2. So it was, you know, sucking in those photons, I guess, right? I'm letting them all come in through the glass. I paid a lot for that glass. I wanted them all to come in and not stop it down. But yeah, the sky was bright. So it's going to limit you at some level, sure.
And it certainly seems like you've overcome that problem. And we're going to hear how you did that, right?
Yeah, well, I mean, you can ask me some more questions, but let me just show you one of the things that I think made this image nice, at least for me, is that when I go through the process, you know, you're going to create a starless version of this data because you need to clean it. It's a mess. I mean, it's a big, big mess. So I do have, let's see what, I have to figure out what things are here. So I can turn off the background as well. No, not that one. This, well, yeah, but yeah, see, I've already cleaned it up. But it's a big mess before you clean it up. But this is like what the starless image looks like. And at the bottom of the sky here, I just literally took, you know how you can use, I would just do something like this, where I make a selection, and then you would just go to content-aware fill, and then I would use the rest of my sky that I kind of cleaned to just put into here. And that just gets rid of all the ground garbage in this image, because in this image, it has partially rejected ground because the ground is all moving in my integrated frames, right? So that's how I got a smooth bottom part here, which is being covered by the horizon eventually. But I didn't want any parts of this mess to kind of show up in the image. The thing that I wanted to point out is that when you create this and then you blend it with your stars, when I've processed this image, I've removed the gradient of the sky entirely, right? So, and this is typically what you do. I mean, when you're imaging at night and you're taking a picture of something up there, you don't want any sky gradients, or you don't want any gradients from light pollution. You're always removing gradients. But when the comet is close to the horizon, especially if you begin literally right after twilight, there is a real sky gradient there, right? And so I thought to myself, though I could put, you know, I could put the ground in here and show the ground and show an image like this. But I just thought that if I instead took one of my earlier pictures, so I on purpose did an exposure that, let me see, do I have it? No, I actually don't have, I'm sorry, I don't have it right here. Let me just disable my mask for a moment. Oh, that's not going to work either. There. This is an image. This was like a, I forget, it's like a 5-second exposure of the sky, but it showed some stars in it, right? And so all I did is a Gaussian blur and just blurred out all the, you know, stars and everything. They went away easy. And then I just have this thing, and I did increase the contrast, and I did increase a little bit the color saturation. So basically, it was just the sky. And then what I decided to do, and I don't remember what I had this at here, was it like 42% or something? Is I use that, and I blended it in. So I have my stars here. So now you can see what it looks like when I blend in, and I'm not blending it in by much, you know, 40%, 50, whatever degree I might want it here. So it looks like a kind of a natural horizon view, right? And then, of course, you put the comet, which is, I don't know what layer, so let me put all these things back together here. Oh, there. So one of these images, oh, there, got rid of it. So this shows, hold on, someone's sending me a message. Let me make sure I'm still live here. Am I live? Yes, I'm live.
Yes, you're live. And by the way, I'm sure everyone noticed you're now in Photoshop, not PixInsight.
Yes, I am. Yes, of course. It should be obvious. If it's not, when you do the compositing of all of these elements of the image, to get the background, to get the, in this case, I'm showing my trick, if you will, of putting a bit of that sky gradient back into the image. Now, it is the actual sky gradient, but I am showing it in order to give it kind of a different sense of this image. I think it has a different feeling than if I didn't have the sky gradient. So certainly you can't do this in PixInsight. This is definitely all Photoshop kind of magic, right? Yeah. Does anyone have any questions about something about this kind of imaging?
Well, there was a question, where did you get the ground image? And that was part of your earlier image that you showed us, right?
Oh, yeah. So in this case, I didn't do anything special. All I did is I don't even know what is this thing? Oh, anyway, all I did is I just I stopped my tracker at the end once I was done imaging the comet. So I stopped my tracker from doing sidereal motion and then just took a picture, longer exposure towards the horizon so that I could dimly see the mountains. I didn't want them to really be a prominent, in this particular case, a prominent part of the image. Something more like a silhouette to me was going to be okay, because I figured I already have two subjects in here. I already have the comet, I have the galaxy. I didn't want the ground to also compete with the other two. Maybe if I just had the comet, then the ground would be more important to me, but by having three subjects, then I figured that's kind of diluting each of the others. So I went with more of a silhouetted background, but I took the background by just doing a longer exposure. I didn't do a blue, sometimes people wait for the sun to set, but while the sky is still bright, you can take a picture of the actual scene as it is. But going to the comment that the other, was it Michelle said, you can take a picture of any, landscape you want at any time you want, and obviously composite it in. But I was going for something that, again, was a little bit more in camera, in the sense that it was all acquired at that same moment of time. Are there any other questions? Because that really was my talk.
No, I think that's fine.
Okay.
Is there an end slide?
There is an end slide. And it's an important one. I'm trying to get to, where is my, now I've lost PowerPoint. Oh, it's this one, right. Yeah, my end slide. Okay, so I showed that this is the image I wanted to show. This is the image before I, did a Gaussian blur. So that's what it looked like. You can see a satellite, you can see some stars. There's a comet right there. The galaxy is right there. It's too early, obviously, to use this image or these kinds of images. I had to wait for it to become darker, but it was useful to me at the end because I could use it as that nice kind of natural component of the image. What I was going to do is, of course, mention that there is an eclipse coming in a week, and I want to wish everyone good luck. I hope the weather holds up for people somewhere. I hope it's me, but it would be great if it, held up for everyone.
Yeah, fingers crossed.
Yeah.
Yeah, I think we can all share that sentiment for sure.
Yeah.
So,
well, we actually have an arrangement for our crew. Some of us will probably get skunked, but we're going to share all the data. Whoever gets the data shares it with the others. I thought you to our audience, you might pass that along too. Not everyone is going to have perfectly clear skies.
I hope I get something. This is actually the image I took with my setup. You can, I don't know, am I still on camera? This is the lens that I would use to do this kind of imaging, which is a 300 millimeter lens. And then I put a teleextender in there to make it 600 millimeters. That's what I made this picture here in my driveway 2 days ago. That sunspot
Adam, you're still sharing, so we get to see the picture of the sun, and we get a little picture of you.
Yeah, okay.
But if you want to show us that rig, you get now just scoot back a little if people can see it.
So you're going to use the 300 millimeter for the Corona shot, right?
Well, I'm not changing it. So my whole, if I have the opportunity to go and do this, the whole thing that I would do is, yeah, I would be interested in the Corona. That's what interests me the most.
The money shot.
Some people, by the way, are real interested in seeing, 12P Pons-Brooks. I say good luck. I mean, I know what it looks like against the twilight sky. Here's a perfect example, and how hard it is to generate, that kind of image that I showed. That's going to be really tough. The eclipse sky is not that much darker than just kind of a typical twilight sky, maybe even brighter in some. So it depends on the distance, but yeah, so that's tough. I think it'd be great just to take a peek at it in binoculars, just to say that you could see a comet in the sky at the same time. But I don't know about trying to take a picture. But someone will do it, right? There's going to be someone out there that takes a picture of the comet and the eclipse, and they will be rained on with praise. It's not me. I think that's
not me. I don't think I have a wide enough field. I don't know. It's 300
Yeah, I mean, you'd
millimeters.
have to use like a 24 millimeter, whatever it is to get the whole thing.
Yeah.
Maybe
And remember the important advice. Yeah, unless this is your 35th eclipse you've seen, watch the eclipse.
Yeah.
Adam, I did have one additional question for you about the Comet, the acquisition process.
Sure.
So you talked about, when you were doing mono, red, green, but, rotating through each filter.
Yeah.
So how are you dealing with focus when you're doing that? Are you using focus offsets or just?
That's correct. Yeah, that's true. I do have an automated system which does have the focus offsets. Yes. Yeah, without the focus offsets, then you might be more limited in your ability to do that. That's true.
Right, I can't imagine you'd want to refocus every time.
No.
Right? Hope they're close enough, right?
And Isaac wants to know what your total integration for that twilight image was.
Oh, good question. So I ended up with, like 120 20-second exposures. So 3 divided, so 40, between 30 to 40 minutes of time.
The sky certainly was changing during that time when
It
so
sure
close.
was. Yeah. So you're getting an average, and then, it's a mess. And then you try to work on the gradients using DBE. Now you could try to use a gradient correction in PixInsight. And then, of course, you'll have to do some cleaning because there's going to be some garbage in there. Yeah, but then you can do it.
I'm sorry, gradient correction, is that something new, better than DBE?
It is something new. It's in PixInsight. It is the new method of correcting gradients. Yes. It was just released now probably a couple weeks ago, and I will be creating some tutorials about it. They recently did something that I think was necessary, and that's why I held off on actually making any content on it, because I could kind of see the behavior of the tool initially. So they've made it so that they can get rid of bulk simple gradients first, and then they can do the kind of gradient correction that they want to do. The original algorithm was trying to do it all in one step, and I found that it didn't work as optimally as you might hope. It's, again, one of those examples where just because you get a result doesn't mean it's the very best you could get. So I think they've proved that.
Is it a process or a script?
It's a process.
It's a process.
Yeah. Gradient correction. Check it out.
Tomorrow. Maybe
Just
tonight.
do tomorrow, right?
Yeah,
Eric?
and from what I had heard in the first place, the defaults are all very good. But I found out tonight, apparently they aren't.
I didn't say they're not good. I just said there is no default.
Yeah.
That's all I said. No default.
Okay. We listen.
All right. Well, Adam, this was fascinating and really very helpful. So, and this is a huge topic, comets and processing comets, but you did a really nice job of encapsulating the important points and, the things that we need to know to at least get started on doing this. And of course, there's lots more detail in your Comet Academy series.
Yeah.
So
yeah, I really dig down into, not only what those steps are, but why you're going to do them. And it's not just an exercise in comets, but it is, of course, it's about image processing. It is about understanding the way to work with data, the way to work with PixInsight. So there's a lot of valuable information there, even if it's not exactly, the exact situation that you find yourself in. You'll still find lots of useful information.
Right. Yeah. Not necessarily exactly the how of your image, but the why, and that frequently is more useful long term, right? So,
Yeah, definitely. Yeah.
All right. Well, I think we've got everything.
Yeah, I think
all the
we're good.
questions, and so thanks again for coming on the show, Adam, and
Of course,
good luck
thank
to
you.
everyone with the eclipse.
Yeah, good luck.
And I want to thank Terry for doing some prestidigitation with, showing us some of that PixInsight stuff. Took some extra work.
Yeah, absolutely. Good job, Terry, on the streaming
Thank you,
tonight.
Terry.
Yeah,
And
we're
with that-
holding our breath. And Adam, we hang on for a little bit after the show ends if
Sure.
you'd like.
Sure.
All right, Terry, take us out.